The morning they left, the rain came down sideways. Not the kind of gentle spring rain that settles into the soil and makes promises about flowers. This was the kind that stung the skin. The kind that reminded you of every bad decision you had ever made, every door that had closed in your face, every phone call that never came. Henry March stood at the window of the two-bedroom apartment he had shared with his wife for 11 years, watching the water trace crooked paths down the glass. His hands were behind his back. His shoulders were straight. He was 73 years old, and he had spent 42 of those years as a structural engineer, and another 11 as a retired man who had slowly, quietly become invisible. The apartment was nearly empty now, not because they were moving to something better, because their son had sat them down on a Tuesday evening, a cold Tuesday, the kind where the furnace in the building groaned and complained, and had explained, with the careful patience of someone delivering bad news to children, that the assisted living facility in Dayton had a waiting list. But he had pulled some strings, and they had 2 weeks to pack. 2 weeks, 42 years of Henry's life had been poured into raising that boy. Sleepless nights, college tuition, a down payment on a house in Columbus when the market was cruel and Henry's back was already starting to ache from decades of standing on concrete floors, running calculations, signing off on beams and foundations and load-bearing walls that would outlive him. And the return on that investment apparently was 2 weeks. Evelyn was in the bedroom. Henry could hear her moving slowly. The rhythm of her footsteps was familiar to him in the way that his own heartbeat was familiar. He didn't have to think about it to know it. She walked with a slight hesitation on her left side now. The arthritis had settled into her hands first, twisting her fingers into shapes that made him want to break something every time he looked at them. Then it had moved to her knees, and then to her hips. And now she moved through the world like a woman walking through shallow water, always aware of the resistance, always conscious of the effort required to do the smallest things. The piano bench was still in the corner of the living room. Henry looked at it and felt something tighten in his chest. The piano itself had been sold 3 years ago, when the arthritis had made it impossible for Evelyn to play for more than a few minutes without wincing. She had not cried when the movers took it. She had stood at the window, the same window Henry was standing at now, in their old apartment, in their old life, and she had watched them carry it away, and she had said nothing. But Henry had seen her hands that night. She had sat on the edge of the bed, looking at her fingers as if they belonged to someone else, turning them over, flexing them, trying to remember what it felt like to press down on a key and have the world answer back with music. The bench had stayed, neither of them had ever said why. The last box was loaded into the back of the truck at 11:47 on a Thursday morning. The truck was a 1994 Ford F-150 that Henry had bought for $600 from a man named Leroy who ran a salvage yard outside of Springfield. The truck had 220,000 miles on it, a transmission that whined in third gear, and a rust hole in the bed the size of Henry's fist. It was also the only thing they owned that was worth more than the clothes on their backs. Their son had offered to drive them to Dayton. Henry had declined, not out of pride, although there was some of that. Not out of anger, although there was plenty of that too. He had declined because he had looked at his son's face, at the way the man's eyes kept sliding away from Henry's, at the way his wife stood behind him with her arms crossed, at the way their Langahadzes had been conspicuously absent from the entire process. And Henry had realized something that he had been avoiding for years. His son was not a bad person. But his son had also stopped seeing him as a father a long time ago. Somewhere along the way, somewhere between the retirement party and the first gray hairs, and the afternoon when Henry had asked for help lifting a bag of concrete mix and his son had sighed like it was an imposition, the relationship had shifted. Henry had become a responsibility, a problem to be managed, a checkbox on a list of obligations that his son was eager to finish checking. The assisted living facility was not cruelty. It was efficiency. And Henry had spent his entire professional life understanding the difference between a structure that could bear weight and a structure that was about to fail. "I'm not going to Dayton," he said. Evelyn looked at him from the passenger seat of the truck. They were sitting in the parking lot of the apartment building. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still the color of old concrete. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled. Behind them, the building stood like a monument to everything they were leaving behind. The thin walls, the landlord who never fixed the leak in the bathroom, the neighbors who had never learned their names. Henry, Evelyn said. That was all. Just his name. But the way she said it told him everything. She was tired, she was scared, she was too old to be starting over, and she loved him too much to say any of those things out loud. "I mean it," he said. "I'm not going to sit in a room in Dayton and wait to die." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and put her hand on his. Her fingers were crooked. The knuckles were swollen, but her touch was still warm, still familiar, still the same hand he had held on their wedding day 49 years ago. "Where are we going?" she asked. Henry looked out the windshield. He had no answer to that question. He had spent his entire life being the kind of man who had answers. When a bridge needed to be inspected, he was the one they called. When a building's foundation was shifting, he was the one who could look at a crack in the wall and tell you exactly how many months it had before it became a problem. He had built his identity on certainty, on precision, on the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the things he designed would stand for generations. And now he was 73 years old, with a failing truck, a wife in pain, and absolutely no idea what came next. He started the engine anyway. The road took them east, not because Henry had a plan, but because east was the direction of the sunrise, and he had always believed, without ever saying it out loud, that there was something hopeful about moving toward the light. They drove for 2 hours in silence. The landscape changed as they left the suburbs behind. The strip malls and chain restaurants gave way to 2-lane highways, and the 2-lane highways gave way to county roads, and the county roads gave way to gravel paths that wound through farmland that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. Silos rose up against the gray sky like monuments to a way of life that was slowly disappearing. Fences sagged, barns leaned, mailboxes stood at odd angles. Their flags rested in the upright position, waiting for letters that never came. Henry stopped for gas at a station that consisted of 2 pumps, a convenience store with a flickering sign, and a man sitting in a plastic chair by the door who watched them with the mild curiosity of someone who had seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. While the pump groaned and the numbers clicked upward, Henry went inside to buy a map. The store smelled like coffee that had been sitting on the burner since dawn, and cigarettes that had been sitting on the shelf even longer. A woman behind the counter was reading a romance novel with a cover that showed a shirtless man embracing a woman whose dress appeared to be in the process of dissolving. She looked up when Henry approached, and her eyes took him in with the kind of efficient assessment that only came from decades of watching strangers pass through. "Lost?" she asked. "No," Henry said. "Just looking for a map." The woman nodded toward a wire rack near the door. "Those are free. Chamber of Commerce puts them out. Mostly they just show where to find antique shops and pie festivals, but they've got roads on them too." Henry took one and unfolded it on the counter. The paper was thin and creased, and it smelled like the inside of a glove compartment. He traced the route they had taken with his finger, then looked at the empty spaces on the map, the places where the road stopped and the land opened up into nothing. "You looking for something specific?" the woman asked. Henry shook his head. "Just driving." The woman closed her book. She was maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of face that had spent a lot of time smiling and a lot of time not smiling, depending on what life had handed her that day. "There's an old Victorian out on County Road 9, she said. "Been empty for 30 years. Folks around here say it's haunted." Henry looked up. "I'm not looking for a haunted house," he said. The woman shrugged. "Didn't say you were. Just saying it's out there. Built in 1887 by a man named Silas Whitmore. He was a railroad baron, back when that meant something. Lived in it for 20 years, then died in the study. Heart attack, they say. But the story got twisted over the years, and now the teenagers come out on Halloween to see if they can get the door to open." "And can they?" "The door?" The woman smiled, and there was something in her expression that Henry couldn't quite read. "No, but that's not because it's haunted. It's because Henry Whitmore, Silas's grandson, last one to live in the place, he sealed up the front door before he left, nailed boards across it, had a big for sale sign put up that's been sitting there so long the sign's almost rotted through." Henry folded the map and tucked it into his back pocket. Why would someone seal up a house instead of selling it? The woman picked up her book again. "That's the question, isn't it?" Evelyn was asleep when Henry got back to the truck. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, not starting the engine, just watching her breathe. Her head was tilted back against the headrest, and her hands were folded in her lap, and for a moment she looked younger, looked like the woman he had married, the woman who had laughed at his jokes and played Chopin on the piano in their first apartment and held his face in her hands when he told her he was scared about becoming a father. The arthritis had taken the Chopin first. Then it had taken the laughter. Not all at once. Slowly. The way rust takes a bridge, one bolt at a time, one girder at a time, until one day you look at it and realize that the structure you trusted is no longer trustworthy. Henry started the truck and pulled back onto the highway. County Road 9 was 12 miles east of the gas station. It was a narrow road with no lines painted on it, bordered on both sides by fields that had been harvested so many times the soil looked exhausted. The houses along the road were few and far between, farmhouses mostly, with peeling paint and porches that sagged in the middle, surrounded by tractors and pickup trucks, and the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own breathing. He almost missed it. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the gate at the entrance was hanging by one hinge. And if Henry hadn't been looking for it, he would have driven right past without a second glance. But he saw the mailbox, a rusted thing with the name Whitmore painted on the side in letters that were barely visible, and he turned the truck onto the gravel drive. The house appeared at the end of a quarter-mile lane, and Henry stopped the truck in the middle of the driveway and just stared. It was magnificent. That was the word that came to him, unbidden, rising up from somewhere deep in his chest where he kept the things he didn't say out loud. The house was 3 stories tall, with a turret on the left side and a wraparound porch that had once been the kind of place where ladies in long dresses sat with glasses of lemonade and watched the world go by. The windows were tall and narrow, arched at the top like church windows, and even though most of them were broken or boarded up, Henry could see the bones of the thing, could see what it had been, what it could be again. The wood siding was gray with age, and there were places where the paint had peeled away entirely, leaving bare wood exposed to the elements. The roof sagged in the middle, and Henry made a mental note about the rafters, about the weight of the snow that had accumulated over 30 winters, about the differential stress that would have built up over time. But the foundation. Henry got out of the truck and walked toward the house, and he didn't realize he was holding his breath until he was standing at the base of the front steps, looking at the stone foundation that rose from the ground like the roots of an ancient tree. It was intact. Not just intact, perfect. The stones were laid with a precision that told Henry everything he needed to know about the man who had built this house. Silas Whitmore had not cut corners. He had not skimped on materials. He had built this house the way Henry himself had always built things, to last, to endure, to stand against the weather and the years and the slow decay of everything. Henry knelt down and ran his hand along the foundation stones. They were cold and rough under his fingers, and he could feel the history in them, the hands that had cut them, the horses that had dragged them into place, the mortar that had been mixed and applied by men who knew they were building something that would outlive their grandchildren. "You've got good bones," Henry said quietly. He didn't realize he had spoken aloud until he heard Evelyn's voice behind him. "You're talking to a house now?" Henry stood up and turned around. Evelyn was standing at the bottom of the driveway, leaning on the cane she had started using 6 months ago, looking at the house with an expression that Henry couldn't quite identify. "It's not haunted," he said. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "The woman at the gas station said it was. The woman at the gas station said teenagers couldn't get the door open. That's not haunted. That's just a door that's been sealed shut." Evelyn looked at the house for a long moment. Then she looked at Henry, and he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years. Something that looked almost like curiosity. Henry shook his head. "She didn't say, then how do you know we can't afford it?" The question hung in the air between them. Henry opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, because the truth was, he didn't know. He hadn't asked. He had made an assumption, the same assumption he had been making for years. The assumption that everything worth having was out of reach, that every door worth opening was locked, that every road worth traveling led to a dead end. "Let me make a phone call," he said. The phone number for the real estate agent was on the for sale sign. The sign was exactly where the woman at the gas station had said it would be, nailed to a post at the end of the driveway, the wood gray and weathered, the letters barely legible. But the phone number was still there, written in fading black ink, and Henry copied it onto the back of his hand with a pen he found in the glove compartment. The call connected on the 4th ring. "Simpson Realty," said a voice that sounded like it had been smoking for 40 years and planned to smoke for 40 more. "This is Frank." Henry introduced himself and explained where he was calling from. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a long pause, the kind of pause that happens when someone is trying to remember something they haven't thought about in a very long time. "The Whitmore place," Frank said finally. "Lord, I haven't had a call about that property in 15 years, maybe longer. Is it still for sale?" Another pause. "Technically, yes. Henry Whitmore. That's the grandson, not the one who built it. He passed away about 10 years ago. The property went to the state, unclaimed I think they called it. But there's a provision in the will that says the house can't be demolished. Something about historical significance. So it's just been sitting there, waiting for someone to come along." "How much?" Frank laughed. It was not a happy laugh. The state assessed it at $12. That's what they assessed all the abandoned properties at, back when they were trying to clear the books. But there's back taxes. About 40 years of back taxes, give or take. And there's the question of the deed and the title search and about 100 other legal complications that would make most people run the other direction. How much would it take to make it ours? Frank was quiet for a moment. Henry could hear him breathing, could hear the creak of an old chair, could hear the distant sound of a television playing somewhere in the background. "Son," Frank said finally, and the word caught Henry off guard because no one had called him son in years. "I'm going to be honest with you. That house is a money pit. The roof is probably caving in. The plumbing is probably shot. The electrical system is probably a fire hazard. And that's just what I can guess from here. You'd need to put $100,000 into that place just to make it livable. Maybe more." "I'm not asking about the renovation costs," Henry said. "I'm asking about the purchase price." Frank sighed. "Tell you what. You come down to my office tomorrow morning and we'll figure it out. Bring your wife. Bring your checkbook if you've got one. And bring a lot of patience, because this is going to take a while." Henry hung up and stood at the end of the driveway, looking at the house. The sun was starting to set behind it, and the light was turning gold and orange, and the kind of pink that made you think about all the sunsets you had taken for granted in your life. The house cast a long shadow across the overgrown lawn, and in that shadow Henry could see the shape of something. Not a ghost, not any of the things the locals whispered about. He could see the shape of a home. They spent the night in a motel 12 miles down the road. The motel was called the Rustic Pines, and it consisted of 8 rooms arranged in a U around a parking lot that was mostly gravel and mostly potholes. The woman at the front desk was named Darlene, and she charged them $40 for the night and gave them a key attached to a plastic diamond that said IXLA Lake Erie. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and bleach, and the bedspread was the color of a faded bruise, and the window air conditioning unit rattled every time it cycled on. But the water was hot and the sheets were clean, and Evelyn fell asleep with her head on Henry's chest before he had even finished brushing his teeth. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathe. The ceiling had a water stain in the corner that looked vaguely like the state of Texas. Henry stared at it and thought about the house, about the foundation, about the turret, about the arched windows and the wraparound porch, and the way the light had looked at sunset. He thought about what Frank had said. $100,000. Maybe more. Henry had $15,000 in savings. That was everything. 42 years of working, of saving, of putting money aside for retirement, and all of it had been eaten up by medical bills, by the slow erosion of a fixed income, by the 1,000 small emergencies that life threw at you when you least expected them. $15,000. That was what stood between them and the street. And now Henry was thinking about spending it on a house that most people would pay to have demolished. But here was the thing about being a structural engineer that most people didn't understand. Most people looked at a house and saw what was on the surface. They saw the peeling paint and the broken windows and the sagging roof, and they made a judgment based on what was visible. But Henry had spent his entire career looking at the things that weren't visible, the beams hidden behind walls, the foundations buried underground, the invisible architecture that held everything together. That house had good bones. He knew it the way a musician knows a chord progression, the way a painter knows a color, the way a man who has spent 42 years studying the physics of load and stress and tension knows that something is true even when he can't explain why. The house was not a money pit. The house was a second chance, and Henry March had spent 11 years being invisible, being discarded, being treated like a problem to be managed. He had watched his wife lose the ability to play the piano. He had watched his son turn into a stranger. He had watched his savings dwindle and his body ache and his world shrink to the size of a 2-bedroom apartment with a landlord who never fixed the leak in the bathroom. He was not going to watch himself die in a facility in Dayton. He was not going to let the world discard him one more time. He closed his eyes, and he listened to the rattle of the air conditioner, and he dreamed about foundation stones, and arched windows and the sound of a piano playing in a room that had been silent for 30 years. Frank Simpson's office was in a strip mall between a pawn shop and a laundromat. The sign above the door said, Simpson Realty, in gold letters that were peeling at the edges, and the window displayed photographs of houses that had been for sale for so long that the paper had turned yellow. Henry pushed open the door and was greeted by the smell of old coffee and older paper, and by the sight of a man who looked exactly like his voice had sounded on the phone. Frank was maybe 70, with a belly that strained against his button-down shirt and a mustache that had been white for so long that Frank himself had probably forgotten it used to be brown. He was sitting behind a desk that was covered in stacks of paper, And he was eating a donut with the kind of concentration that suggested this was not his first donut of the morning. "You must be Henry," Frank said, wiping his hands on a napkin. "And you must be Evelyn." Evelyn nodded and took a seat in one of the chairs across from Frank's desk. Henry remained standing because he had never been good at sitting still when there was work to be done. "I did some digging last night," Frank said, pulling a folder from one of the stacks. "The Whitmore property, County Road 9, approximately 3 acres give or take. The house itself is 4,200 square feet, which is a lot of house for 2 people if you don't mind my saying so." "We don't mind," Evelyn said quietly. Frank raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. He opened the folder and spread out a series of documents across the desk. Deeds and tax records and handwritten notes that had been stuffed into the file over the course of decades. "Here's the situation," Frank said. "The property has been in tax delinquency since 1987. That's 36 years, give or take. The state technically owns it, but there's a right of redemption period that expired years ago, so it's essentially just sitting in limbo. The county would love to see it sold because they'd get the back taxes, but nobody's been willing to take it on." "What are the back taxes?" Henry asked. Frank shuffled through the papers. $19,000, give or take, plus interest and penalties. The county has been adding to the balance every year, but they've also been writing off most of it as uncollectible. If you were to make an offer, they'd probably be willing to settle for a fraction of that. "And the purchase price?" Frank leaned back in his chair. "The state's assessment is $12, like I told you, but that's just a number on a piece of paper. The real question is what you're willing to pay to make the legal headaches go away." Henry looked at Evelyn. She was sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the document spread across Frank's desk. She looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle, like she was trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together, how the numbers added up. How 2 old people with $15,000 in savings could possibly afford a house that needed $100,000 in repairs. "We have $15,000, Henry said. Frank didn't blink. $15,000 won't cover the renovations. "We know that. Then what's your plan?" Henry was quiet for a moment. He thought about the foundation stones. He thought about the bones of the house, the invisible architecture, the things that could be saved if someone was willing to do the work themselves. "I'm a structural engineer," Henry said. "I spent 42 years designing buildings and inspecting bridges and making sure things didn't fall down. I know how to fix a roof. I know how to rewire a house. I know how to replace plumbing. I know how to do almost everything that needs to be done, and the things I don't know, I can learn." Frank looked at Henry for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. Then he looked back at Henry. "You're serious," Frank said. "It wasn't a question. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. You understand that I'm going to look like an idiot if I help you do this. Everybody in this county thinks that house is cursed. They've been telling stories about it for 30 years. If I sell it to a couple of retirees for $12, people are going to think I've lost my mind." "Let them think what they want," Evelyn said. Frank looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. He had been looking at Henry like he was trying to figure out if the old man was crazy, but when he looked at Evelyn, he saw something else. Saw the quiet determination in her eyes. Saw the way she sat with her hands folded and her back straight. Saw the dignity of a woman who had been counted out and was refusing to stay down. Frank picked up his phone. "Let me make some calls." The paperwork took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of phone calls and emails and visits to the county courthouse. 3 weeks of Frank Simpson calling in favors and calling in markers and calling in every bit of goodwill he had accumulated in 40 years of selling houses to people who mostly just wanted a place to live. 3 weeks of Henry pacing the floor of the Rustic Pines motel room while Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap, watching him. Waiting. On the morning of the 22nd day, Frank called with the news. "The county agreed to settle for $8,000, he said. "That covers the back taxes and the legal fees. The state is waiving the purchase price entirely because they're just glad to have the property off their books. So you're looking at $8,000 to own the house plus another $2,000 for the closing costs and the title insurance." "That leaves us with $5,000, Henry said. "For renovations," Frank said. He didn't sound optimistic. "Henry, I want to be clear with you. $5,000 is not enough to fix that house. It's not even enough to fix the roof. You're going to run out of money before you run out of problems." "We'll figure it out," Henry said. He hung up and looked at Evelyn. She was standing at the window of the motel room, looking out at the parking lot, at the potholes, and the gravel and the faded sign that said vacancy. "We're going to need help," Evelyn said. Henry nodded. "I know. Not the kind of help we can buy, the kind of help we have to ask for." Henry knew what she was saying. She was saying that they couldn't do this alone. She was saying that two old people with $5,000 and a truck that whined in third gear could not restore a Victorian mansion by themselves, no matter how good the bones were. She was saying that they needed to be part of a community, needed to let people in, needed to trust, needed to stop trying to carry the weight of the world on their own shoulders. Henry had never been good at asking for help, but he was starting to understand that the man he used to be, the man who could solve any problem, who could handle any challenge, who could walk into a room and command respect just by being there, that man was gone. The world had moved on. His body had betrayed him. His son had abandoned him. And if Henry was going to survive, if he was going to build something new out of the wreckage of his old life, he was going to have to become someone he had never been before. He was going to have to be vulnerable. "We'll ask," he said. Evelyn turned from the window and looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was just looking at him the way she had looked at him on their wedding day. Like he was the only man in the world, like she had made the right choice, like she would follow him anywhere, even into a haunted house on County Road 9. "I love you," she said. Henry crossed the room and took her hands, her crooked, swollen, arthritic hands, and held them in his own. "I love you too," he said. "Now let's go home." The key turned in the lock on a Thursday afternoon. It was not the original lock, because the original lock had been rusted solid for decades. Frank had called a locksmith, a man named Earl, who showed up in a truck that had more rust than Henry's Ford, and Earl had spent 2 hours drilling out the old mechanism and installing a new one. When he was finished, he handed Henry a single brass key and said, "Don't lose this one. I'm the only locksmith in 3 counties, and I charge double for emergency calls." Henry put the key in the lock and turned it. The door groaned. It was not a dramatic sound. It was not the kind of sound you heard in movies, where the ancient hinges scream and the darkness yawns open and the music swells to tell you that something terrible is about to happen. It was just the sound of a door that had been closed for 30 years finally being asked to open. The hinges protested, the wood creaked, and then, slowly, reluctantly, the door swung inward. The smell hit them first. It was the smell of time, of dust and decay, of old wood and older secrets, of a house that had been holding its breath for 3 decades and was only now starting to exhale. The air was thick and cool, and it carried with it the faintest trace of something sweet, lavender maybe, or rosewater, as if the ghost of a long-dead woman was still walking through the rooms, trailing perfume behind her. Henry stepped inside. The foyer was grand, that was the only word for it. The ceiling soared 2 stories above them, and a staircase curved upward along the left wall, its banister carved with intricate patterns that Henry recognized as Victorian Gothic. The floor was black and white marble, laid in a checkerboard pattern that had been worn smooth by a century of footsteps. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, a massive thing of crystal and brass that had collapsed under its own weight at some point, leaving a tangle of metal and glass dangling over the center of the room. Dust covered everything. Not the thin layer of dust you might find in a house that had been closed up for a few months. This was the dust of decades, thick and gray and soft, like a blanket that had been spread over every surface and left to settle. It coated the floor and the walls, and the remains of the furniture that still sat in the corners. A sideboard here, a mirror there, the skeleton of a grandfather clock whose face had long since cracked and fallen inward. Henry walked forward slowly, his footsteps muffled by the dust, his eyes moving across the space like he was reading a book. He saw the crown molding, still intact. He saw the plaster walls, cracked but not crumbling. He saw the windows, most of them broken, but the frame still square, still true. He stopped in the center of the foyer and looked up. The ceiling had water damage. He had expected that. What he hadn't expected was the way the light came through the broken windows, the way it fell in shafts across the dust, illuminating particles that floated in the air like snow. It was beautiful in a sad and broken way. It was the beauty of something that had been loved once and then forgotten and was now being remembered again. Evelyn came up beside him. She was using her cane, and she moved slowly, carefully, testing each step before she put her weight on it. But her eyes were alive in a way they hadn't been in years, moving from detail to detail, taking in the chandelier and the staircase, and the arched doorway that led to what must have been the parlor. "There's a piano in there," she said quietly. Henry looked at her. "How do you know?" Evelyn pointed toward the parlor. "I can see the legs, through the doorway." Henry walked to the arched entrance and looked inside. The parlor was smaller than the foyer, with a fireplace at one end and a bay window at the other. The window was intact, one of the few that still had all its glass, and the afternoon light was pouring through it, falling across the floor in a golden rectangle. And in that rectangle of light, covered in dust and cobwebs, sat a piano. It was a Steinway. Henry knew enough about pianos to recognize the name, even through the grime. It was an upright, not a grand, but it was solid and old and looked like it had been built in the same era as the house. The keys were yellowed, the strings were visible through a crack in the front panel, and the bench was pushed back from the keyboard as if the last person who had played it had simply stood up and walked away, intending to return in just a moment. But that moment had lasted 30 years. Evelyn was standing in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame, her eyes fixed on the piano. Henry could see her hands trembling, not from the arthritis, not this time, but from something else. Something that looked like grief and hope and 1,000 other emotions all tangled together. "We don't have to stay," Henry said quietly. "We can turn around right now and we can find somewhere else and we can—" "No," Evelyn said. The word was soft, but it was firm. It was the kind of word that closed doors and opened windows. It was the kind of word that changed things. "This is where we're supposed to be," Evelyn said. She took a step into the parlor, then another, and Henry watched as his wife, his strong, stubborn, beautiful wife, walked across the dusty floor and sat down on the piano bench. She didn't play. She couldn't play, not with her hands, not anymore. But she sat there in the rectangle of golden light, with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she looked at the piano like it was an old friend she had given up on ever seeing again. "This is where we're supposed to be," she said again. And Henry believed her. The first week was about survival. Not the dramatic kind of survival, not the kind where you're fighting off wild animals or rationing water, or any of the things that happen in movies. It was the quiet kind of survival. The kind where you wake up every morning and make a list of everything that needs to be done, and you start at the top, and you work your way down. And you don't stop until your hands are bleeding and your back is screaming and the sun has gone down and you can't see well enough to keep going. The roof was the first priority. Henry had known this even before he walked through the front door. A roof that had been neglected for 30 years was a roof that was failing in 100 different ways. Shingles missing, flashing corroded, rafters rotted, water leaking into the attic and running down the walls and soaking into the plaster. If they didn't fix the roof, everything else was pointless. The house would continue to decay and eventually it would collapse and all the foundation stones in the world wouldn't save it. Henry spent 3 days on the roof. He was not young, his knees ached, his hands shook when he tried to grip the hammer. His back screamed every time he bent over to pick up a shingle. But he kept going, because stopping was not an option, and because every time he looked down and saw Evelyn sitting on the front porch, reading a book, or just watching the clouds, he remembered why he was doing this. He had been a structural engineer. He knew how to calculate load and stress and tension. He knew how to design a roof that would last for 100 years. But knowing how to do something and actually doing it were two different things, and Henry was learning, slowly, painfully, that his body was not the same body that had climbed scaffolding and walked across steel beams 40 years ago. His body was old, his body was tired, his body was not going to cooperate with him no matter how much he willed it to. On the third day, he fell. It wasn't a long fall, just a few feet from the lower section of the roof to the porch below. But he landed badly on his left shoulder, and the pain was immediate and white-hot and so intense that he couldn't breathe for a moment. He lay on the porch floor, staring up at the sky, waiting for the pain to subside enough that he could move. "Henry?" Evelyn's voice. She had been in the kitchen, what was left of the kitchen, trying to get the ancient faucet to produce something other than rust-colored water. Now she was standing over him, her face pale, her hands reaching for him. "I'm okay," Henry said. He wasn't okay, his shoulder was screaming, his pride was screaming louder. But he was a 73-year-old man who had spent his entire life being the one who fixed things, the one who solved problems, the one who kept everyone safe. He was not going to admit that he had fallen off a roof like some careless teenager. "You're bleeding," Evelyn said. Henry looked at his arm. There was blood, more than he would have expected, running down from his elbow and dripping onto the porch floor. He must have caught his arm on something on the way down. A nail, maybe, or a piece of broken flashing. "I'm okay," he said again. Evelyn knelt beside him. The movement was difficult for her. He could see the strain in her face, the way her joints protested. But she did it anyway because that was who she was. She had spent 49 years taking care of him, and she wasn't going to stop now, even if it hurt her. "We need help," Evelyn said. Henry closed his eyes. The sky was blue above him, and the clouds were moving slowly, and he could hear birds singing somewhere in the trees that surrounded the property. It was a beautiful day. It was the kind of day that made you believe that everything was going to be okay. "We need help," he agreed. Rose's diner was exactly where the woman at the gas station had said it would be, on the main street of a town called Millbrook, population 847 according to the sign at the town limits. The diner was a single-story building with a red neon sign that said "Eat," and a parking lot that was mostly gravel and mostly empty when Henry pulled in at 11:30 on a Thursday morning. The bell above the door jingled when he walked in. The diner was small, maybe 10 booths and a counter with 8 stools. The walls were covered in photographs of Millbrook from decades past, and the air smelled like bacon and coffee and the faint sweet scent of pie. There were maybe a dozen people scattered throughout the restaurant, most of them old, most of them alone, most of them eating with the quiet concentration of people who had been eating in the same place at the same time for years. The woman behind the counter was the same woman from the gas station. Henry recognized her immediately. The gray ponytail, the face that had seen everything, the romance novel that was sitting next to the cash register. She looked up when he walked in and her eyes widened slightly, and then she smiled. "You bought it," she said. Henry slid onto one of the stools at the counter. "We bought it. The Whitmore place." "Yes." The woman shook her head slowly. She was wearing a white apron over a floral blouse, and her name tag said Rose in block letters. "I didn't think anyone would actually do it. I've been telling people about that house for 20 years, and nobody's ever even asked to see it." "We didn't see it before we bought it," Henry said. "We just showed up." Rose laughed. It was a warm laugh, the kind that made you feel like you'd known her for years. "That sounds about right. That house doesn't show itself to people who come looking for it. It shows itself to people who aren't looking at all." Henry didn't know what to say to that, so he ordered coffee and a slice of apple pie and sat in silence while Rose poured him a cup that had probably been sitting on the burner since dawn. The coffee was terrible. Bitter and dark and strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot, and it was something to hold, and Henry found that he needed something to hold. "You look like a man who fell off a roof," Rose said. Henry looked down at his arm. The bandage Evelyn had wrapped around his elbow was visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve, and there was a dark bruise spreading across his forearm that hadn't been there this morning. "I fell off a roof," he admitted. Rose leaned against the counter. "You're fixing it up yourself?" "I'm trying to." "How's that going?" Henry took a bite of pie. The pie was good. Better than good, actually. The crust was flaky and the apples were tart and sweet. And for a moment, Henry forgot about the roof and the shoulder and the $5,000 that was dwindling faster than he wanted to admit. "Slowly," he said. "And painfully." Rose nodded. She looked at him for a long moment, and Henry could see her making a decision. Could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the weighing of options, the consideration of whether to say something or let it pass. "You need help," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Henry said. Rose reached under the counter and pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. She wrote something on the paper, a phone number Henry saw, and a name, and slid it across the counter. "Call this number," she said. "His name is Tommy. He's 19 years old, and he's strong as an ox, and he's been looking for something to do with his summer. He'll work for $10 an hour and whatever you can feed him." Henry looked at the paper. Tommy. The phone number was written in Rose's careful handwriting, the numbers rounded and neat. "I can't afford $10 an hour," Henry said. Rose shrugged. "Then pay him less, or don't pay him at all. The boy needs something to do. He's been getting into trouble lately. Nothing serious, just the kind of trouble that happens when a kid has too much time and not enough direction. If you give him a reason to show up every morning, that's worth more than money." Henry folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said. Rose poured him more coffee. "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you see how much that boy can eat." He was driving a pickup truck that was even older and more beaten up than Henry's. A Chevrolet from the early 80s maybe, with a bumper held on by baling wire and a muffler that sounded like it was actively dying. He parked next to Henry's Ford and got out, and Henry saw that Rose's description had been accurate. The boy was strong as an ox, with shoulders that strained against his t-shirt and hands that looked like they had been doing physical labor since birth. "You're Henry?" Tommy said. "I'm Henry." Tommy looked at the house. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stood there with his hands on his hips, taking it in, the broken windows, the sagging roof, the overgrown lawn, the whole sad, beautiful, impossible thing. "My aunt said you fell off the roof," Tommy said. "I did? Are you going to fall off again?" Henry almost smiled. "I'm going to try not to." Tommy nodded. He walked over to the house and put his hand on one of the porch columns, testing it, feeling the wood. Then he turned back to Henry and said, "Where do you want me to start?" Henry had made a list. It was a long list, written on a piece of paper that was already smudged and creased from being folded and unfolded a dozen times. The list was divided into 3 sections: urgent, important, and eventually. The urgent section was the longest. It included the roof, the broken windows, the plumbing, the electrical system, and about 20 other things that needed to be addressed before the house could be considered safe. But Henry had learned something in the past week. He had learned that if you looked at the whole list at once, it was overwhelming. It was impossible. It was a mountain that could never be climbed. But if you looked at just one thing, just one small manageable task, it was possible. It was doable. It was a step. "Let's start with the porch," Henry said. They spent the morning replacing the rotted floorboards on the wraparound porch. It was simple work. Pull up the old boards, cut new ones to size, nail them into place. But it was the kind of work that showed progress, that made you feel like you were actually accomplishing something. By noon, they had replaced a quarter of the porch floor, and Henry's back was aching and Tommy's t-shirt was soaked with sweat, and they sat on the front steps and ate sandwiches that Evelyn had made for them. "Where are you from?" Tommy asked. "Dayton," Henry said. "Originally, we've been living in Columbus for the past 11 years. Why'd you leave?" Henry chewed his sandwich. It was tuna salad on white bread, the way Evelyn had always made it, with celery and a little bit of onion and just enough mayonnaise to hold it together. It was familiar and comforting and made him think of 100 other lunches on 100 other days. "Our son put us in a home," Henry said.